If your wedding pictures show you with a toothpick in your mouth, you might be a redneck. If your soap on a rope doubles as an air freshener, you might be a redneck. If your dog and your wallet are both on a chain, you might be a redneck. If you are still scalping tickets after the concert is over, you might be a redneck. If you have ever filled your deer tag on the golf course, you might be a redneck. If your hometown considers your beer can collection a tourist attraction, you might be a redneck. If your handkerchief doubles as your shirt sleeve, you might be a redneck. If your all-time favorite movie is Cannonball Run, you might be a redneck. If you think there's no reason to stop at a rest area when there's an empty bottle in the car, you might be a redneck. If after your dog farted, you claimed it, you might be a redneck. If 5th grade was the best 4 years of your life, you might be a redneck. If you have lost a tooth opening a beer bottle, you might be a redneck. If your mama doesn't bother to remove the lit Marlboro from her lips before telling the state trooper to kiss her ass, you might be a redneck. If your favorite t-shirt is offensive in 13 states, you might be a redneck. If you can't tell what color your car is because of the dirt, you might be a redneck. If you have been on TV more than 5 times describing the sound of a tornado, you might be a redneck. If the first words out of your mouth every time you see friends are howdy, hey, or how y'all doing, you might be a redneck. If the dog catcher calls for a backup unit when he visits your house, you might be a redneck. If the people on Jerry Springer remind you of your neighbors, you might be a redneck. If you have ever used a weed whacker indoors, you might be a redneck. If you have a hefty bag for the passenger side window of your car, you might be a redneck. If you have a house that's mobile and 5 cars that aren't, you might be a redneck. If you go down to the creek to take a bath, you might be a redneck. If the hood and one door are a different color from the rest of your car, you might be a redneck. If you prefer car keys to Q-tips, you might be a redneck. If your mama tore her best dress coon hunting, you might be a redneck. If you are moved to tears every time you hear Dolly Parton singing I Will Always Love You, you might be a redneck. If you read the Auto Trader with a highlighter, you might be a redneck. If you have ever hit a deer with your car deliberately, you might be a redneck. If someone asks to see your ID and you show them your belt buckle, you might be a redneck. If you consider yourself a light beer drinker, because you start drinking as soon as it gets light, you might be a redneck. If there are more dishes in your sink than in your cabinets, you might be a redneck. If the Salvation Army declines your mattress, you might be a redneck. If your baby's favorite teething ring is the garden hose in the yard, you might be a redneck. If you know how many bales of hay your car will hold, you might be a redneck. If the UFO hotline limits you to 1 call a day, you might be a redneck. If you have ever scratched your sister's name out of the message for a good time, call you have ever shot a deer from inside your house, you might be a redneck. If you consider outdoor life deep reading, you might be a redneck. If your pocket knife has ever been referred to as exhibitor, you might be a redneck. If you have flowers planted in a bathroom appliance in your front yard, you might be a redneck. If you've been married 3 times and still have the same in-laws, you might be a redneck. If your Christmas card includes a Xerox of your butt, you might be a redneck. If you consider yourself an entrepreneur because of the dirt for sale sign in the front yard, you might be a redneck. If you use a 55 Chevy as a guest house, you might be a redneck. If you have a picture of Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, or Elvis over your fireplace, you might be a redneck. If you have ever used lard in bed, you might be a redneck. If your birth announcement included the word rugrat, you might be a redneck. If you have ever hitchhiked naked, you might be a redneck. If you have ever bought a used cap, you might be a redneck. If you are still holding on to Confederate money because you think the South will rise again, you might be a redneck. If your favorite actors are Gummer Pyle, Goober, and Barney Fife, you might be a redneck. If you have ever financed a tattoo, you might be a redneck. If when any of your kids were born, you were shooting pool, you might be a redneck. If you have ever held somebody up with a cork gun, you might be a redneck. If you have never paid for a haircut, you might be a redneck. If your wife has ever said, "Come move this transmission so's I can take me bath," you might be a redneck. If you are an expert on worm beds, you might be a redneck. If your sister is the 3rd generation of women in your family to conceive a baby as a result of an alien abduction, you might be a redneck. If you wish your house looked like that one at the beginning of Beverly Hillbillies, you might be a redneck. If you only need one more hole punch to get your freebie at the House of Tattoos, you might be a redneck. If your coat of arms features kudzu, you might be a redneck. If you mow your lawn and find a car, you might be a redneck. If you've bathed with flea and tick soap, you might be a redneck. If your property has been mistaken for a recycling center, you might be a redneck. If you think Dom Perignon is a mafia leader, you might be a redneck. If you can change the oil in your truck without ducking your head, you might be a redneck. If your secret family recipe is illegal, you might be a redneck. If you spent more on your pickup truck than on your education, you might be a redneck. If your neighbors think you're a detective because a cop always brings you home, you might be a redneck. If your wheelbarrow breaks and it takes 4 relatives to figure out how to fix it, you might be a redneck. If your idea of foreplay is to yell, "Hey, sis. You awake?" you might be a redneck. If your mama gives you tips on how to sneak booze into sporting events, you might be a redneck. If your masseur uses lard, you might be a redneck. If you have 5 cars that are immobile and a house that is, you might be a redneck. If you have any relatives named Elmer or Jed, you might be a redneck. If your 4-year-old is a member of the NRA, you might be a redneck. If Red Man sends you a Christmas card, you might be a redneck. If you think the French Riviera is a foreign car, you might be a redneck. If you bring your dog to work with you, you might be a redneck. If the tail light covers of your car are made of red tape, you might be a redneck. If you burn your yard rather than mow it, you might be a redneck. If you think a turtleneck is a key ingredient in soup, you might be a redneck. If you consider 7th grade your senior year, you might be a redneck. If you sit on your roof at Christmas time hoping to fill your deer quota, you might be a redneck. If you let your 14-year-old daughter smoke at the dinner table in front of her kids, you might be a redneck. If you consider a good tan to be the back of your neck and the left arm below the shirt sleeve, you might be a redneck. If you honestly believe women are turned on by animal noises and seductive tongue gestures, you might be a redneck. If your wife has a beer belly and you find it attractive, you might be a redneck. If you think the O.J. trial was the big sunkist and Minute Maid taste test, you might be a redneck. If your dad is also your favorite uncle, you might be a redneck. If you think doctoring involves mama's sewing kit and a jug, you might be a redneck. If you offer to give someone the shirt off your back and they don't want it, you might be a redneck. If you have ever used a toilet seat as a picture frame, you might be a redneck. If you think a hot tub is a stolen bathroom fixture, you might be a redneck. If you keep flea and tick soap in the shower, you might be a redneck. If your mama calls you over to help, cause she has a flat tire on her house, you might be a redneck. If your wife's hairdo attracts bees, you might be a redneck. If someone in your family died right after saying, "Hey, guys, watch this," you might be a redneck. If your favorite hunting dog has a bigger tombstone than Grandpa, you might be a redneck. If you can't marry your sweetheart because there are laws against it, you might be a redneck. If your most expensive shoes have numbers on the heels, you might be a redneck. If you have ever been involved in a custody fight over a hunting dog, you might be a redneck. If the rear tires on your car are twice as wide as the front ones, you might be a redneck. If you've been kicked out of the zoo for heckling the monkeys, you might be a redneck. If you have ever barbecued spam, you might be a redneck. If you think the term dual airbags refers to your wife and mother-in-law, you might be a redneck. If you roll your hair with soup cans and wash it once a year, you might be a redneck. If your biggest ambition in life is to get that big LA coon, you might be a redneck. If your hunting DAWG cost more than your truck, you might be a redneck. If you think a quarter horses that ride in front of Kmart, you might be a redneck. If there is a wasp nest in your living room, you might be a redneck. If Jack Daniels is on your list of most admired people, you might be a redneck. If you grow Vidalia onions rather than considering them a gourmet item, you might be a redneck. If you have a color-coordinated rope tying down your car hood, you might be a redneck. If you have ever stood in line to get your picture taken with a freak of nature, you might be a redneck. If most of your clothes have logos, you might be a redneck. If you judge drive time by the number of beers you need to take, you might be a redneck. If you've ever used your ironing board as a buffet table, you might be a redneck. If directions to your house include turn off the paved road, you might be a redneck. If your grandmother has ammo on her Christmas list, you might be a redneck. If you've ever gotten dog hair out of your belly button, you might be a redneck. If your bumper sticker says, "My other car is a combine," you might be a redneck. If your mama has ever stomped into the house and announced, "The feud is back on," you might be a redneck. If going to the bathroom late at night involves pulling on boots and a flashlight, you might be a redneck. If you have ever been too drunk to fish, you might be a redneck. If your gene pool doesn't have a deep end, you might be a redneck. If you have ever barbecued hamburgers at the drive-in, you might be a redneck. If you consider pork and beans gourmet food, you might be a redneck. If you have more than 2 brothers named Bubba or Junior, you might be a redneck. If during your senior year you and your mother had homeroom together, you might be a redneck. If you keep empty beer cans in your fridge for your friends that don't drink, you might be a redneck. If you've used your ironing board as a buffet table, you might be a redneck. If you have ever shot at anybody over a parking space, you might be a redneck. If your richest relative buys a new house and you have to help take off the wheels, you might be a redneck. If you take a fishing pole to SeaWorld, you might be a redneck. If you think the last words of the Star-Spangled Banner are "Gentlemen, start your engines," you might be a redneck. If you hear lawn ornaments and think of automobiles, you might be a redneck. If Exxon and Conoco have offered you royalties for your hair, you might be a redneck. If you have a velvet picture of Elvis bought from a roadside stand, you might be a redneck. If your idea of safe sex doesn't include anyone else, you might be a redneck. If you go to the stock car races and don't need a program, you might be a redneck. If all of your four-letter words are 2 syllables, you might be a redneck. If your boat has not left the driveway in 15 years, you might be a redneck. If your wife weighs more than your refrigerator, you might be a redneck. If you consider a six-pack and a bug zapper high-quality entertainment, you might be a redneck. If your complete set of salad bowls are all labeled Cool Whip, you might be a redneck. If you consider John Deere green, Ford blue, and Primer gray the 3 primary colors, you might be a redneck. If your idea of a 7-course meal is a bucket of KFC and a 6-pack, you might be a redneck. If you have ever spray painted your girlfriend's name on an overpass, you might be a redneck. If there are more fish on your wall than pictures, you might be a redneck. If you can belch your name, you might be a redneck. If you have totaled every car you have ever owned, you might be a redneck. If you think Campho-Phenique is a miracle drug, you might be a redneck. If the most commonly heard phrase at your family reunion is, "What are you looking at, shithead?" you might be a redneck. If getting a package from your post office requires a full tank of gas in the truck, you might be a redneck. If you think Old Yeller is a movie about your brother's tooth, you might be a redneck. If you think a subdivision is part of a math problem, you might be a redneck. If that billboard that says just say no to crack reminds you to pull up your jeans, you might be a redneck. If the same pair of boots has been in your family for 3 generations and they're only 10 years old, you might be a redneck. If your kid takes a siphon hose to show and tell, you might be a redneck. If you look like Willie Nelson after you get a haircut, you might be a redneck. If your primary source of income is the pawn shop, you might be a redneck. If when you run out of gas, you put gin in the gas tank, you might be a redneck. If on your first date you had to ask your dad to borrow the keys to the tractor, you might be a redneck. If your wife has ever burned out an electric razor, you might be a redneck. If your wife can climb a tree faster than your cat, you might be a redneck. If you think Dom Perignon is a mafia leader, you might be a redneck. If you consider your license plate personalized, because your daddy made it, you might be a redneck. If you wonder how service stations keep their restrooms so clean, you might be a redneck. If your toilet paper has page numbers, you might be a redneck. If you have ever raked leaves in your kitchen, you might be a redneck. If you take your dog for a walk and you both use the same tree, you might be a redneck. If you stand under the mistletoe at Christmas and wait for Granny and Cousin Sue Ellen to walk by, you might be a redneck. If you bought a VCR so you could tape wrestling while you were at work, you might be a redneck. If your parakeet knows the phrase, "Open up! Police!" you might be a redneck. If you consider a 3-piece suit to be a pair of overalls, a plaid flannel shirt, and thermal underwear, you might be a redneck. If you can tell your age by the number of rings in the bathtub, you might be a redneck. If there are more than 5 McDonald's bags currently on the floorboard of your car, you might be a redneck. If your screen door has no screen, you might be a redneck. If you have ever climbed a water tower with a bucket of paint to defend your sister's honor, you might be a redneck. If you own mirrored sunglasses, you might be a redneck. If you call your boss dude, you might be a redneck. If you have a rag for a gas cap, you might be a redneck. If the highlight of your parties is when you flip out your false teeth, you might be a redneck. If you think a subdivision is part of a math problem, you might be a redneck. If you think taking out the trash means taking your in-laws to a movie, you might be a redneck. If you think taking your wife on a cruise means circling the Dairy Queen, you might be a redneck. If Thanksgiving dinner was ruined because you ran out of ketchup, you might be a redneck. If your kids take a siphon hose to show and tell, you might be a redneck. If your school fight song was dueling banjos, you might be a redneck. If the neighbors started a petition over your Christmas lights, you might be a redneck. If your 2-year-old has more teeth than you do, you might be a redneck. If you took a fishing pole to SeaWorld, you might be a redneck. If you were shooting pool when any of your kids was born, you might be a redneck. If you can spit without opening your mouth, you might be a redneck. If in high school you dated your daddy's current wife, you might be a redneck. If your wife keeps a can of Vienna sausage in her purse, you might be a redneck. If you have ever made change in the offering plate, you might be a redneck. If the most serious loss from the earthquake was your Conway Twitty record collection, you might be a redneck. If your dad walks you to school because you are both in the same grade, you might be a redneck. If none of your shirts cover your stomach, you might be a redneck. If your wife's hairdo has ever been ruined by a ceiling fan, you might be a redneck. If there is a sheet hanging in your closet and a gun rack hanging in your truck, you might be a redneck. If you missed 5th grade graduation because you had jury duty, you might be a redneck. If your classes at school were cancelled because the path to the restroom was flooded, you might be a redneck. If you think BMW is the call letters for a radio station, you might be a redneck. If you have ever stolen clothes from a scarecrow, you might be a redneck. If the ASPCA raids your kitchen, you might be a redneck. If you have a complete set of salad bowls and they all say Cool Whip on the side, you might be a redneck. If your grandfather executes the pull my finger trick at the family reunion, you might be a redneck. If you think a hot tub is a stolen indoor plumbing fixture, you might be a redneck. If you have ever driven with your seat belt hanging out your door making sparks, you might be a redneck. If your entire family has ever sat around waiting for a call from the governor to spare a loved one, you might be a redneck. If the biggest fashion risk you take is which plaid you'll wear to the 4-H fair, you might be a redneck. If Santa Claus refuses to let your kids sit in his lap, you might be a redneck. If you have ever been arrested for loitering, you might be a redneck. If your wedding was held in the delivery room, you might be a redneck. If you thought the Unabomber was a wrestler, you might be a redneck. If you think Cur is a breed of dog, you might be a redneck. If your brother-in-law is also your uncle, you might be a redneck. If you have a gun rack on your bicycle, you might be a redneck. If fewer than half of your cars run, you might be a redneck. If you think the Nutcracker is something you did off the high dive, you might be a redneck. If you use the term over yonder more than once a month, you might be a redneck. If your grandmother can correctly execute the sleeper hold, you might be a redneck. If your wife's job requires her to wear an orange vest, you might be a redneck. If your local ambulance has a trailer hitch, you might be a redneck. If the biggest city you've ever been to is Walmart, you might be a redneck. If your child's first words are attention Kmart shoppers, you might be a redneck. If your entire family sat around waiting for a call from the governor to spare a loved one, you might be a redneck. If you saved lots of money on your honeymoon by going deer hunting, you might be a redneck. If you have ever worn a cowboy hat to church, you might be a redneck. If your pet parrot knows how to whistle the theme song to the Andy Griffith Show, you might be a redneck. If the best way to keep things cold is to leave them in the shade, you might be a redneck. If your stereo speakers formerly belonged to the Moonlight Drive-In Theater, you might be a redneck. If the Halloween pumpkin on your porch has more teeth than your spouse, you might be a redneck. If you think a vulva is part of a woman's anatomy, you might be a redneck. If you use your fishing license as a form of ID, you might be a redneck. If your good deed for the month was hiding your brother for a few days, you might be a redneck. If people hear your car long before they see it, you might be a redneck. If you have ever participated in a distance spitting contest, you might be a redneck. If you think the mountain men in Deliverance were just misunderstood, you might be a redneck. If birds are attracted to your beard, you might be a redneck. If you haul more than you whore, you might be a redneck. If people are scared to touch your wife's bathrobe, you might be a redneck. If your dog can't watch you eat without gagging, you might be a redneck. If you think the stock market has a fence around it, you might be a redneck. If your girlfriend thinks the way you pick your nose is cute, you might be a redneck. If you take your dog for a walk and both use the same tree, you might be a redneck. If your best ashtray is a turtle shell, you might be a redneck. If you think taking a dip has nothing to do with water, you might be a redneck. If the one what hangs round over yonder, back of Bubba's bum, you might be a redneck. If you have ever used the O on a stop sign to sight your new rifle, you might be a redneck. If you hit a bump in the road and lose half of your worldly possessions, you might be a redneck. If you keep your taxidermist's number on speed dial, you might be a redneck. If you keep a can of Raid on the kitchen table, you might be a redneck. If you fainted when you met Slim Whitman, you might be a redneck. If you own more cowboy boots than sneakers, you might be a redneck. If you've hit on somebody in a VD clinic, you might be a redneck. If you know of at least 6 different ways to bend the bill of a baseball hat, you might be a redneck. If a full-grown ostrich has fewer feathers than your cowboy hat, you might be a redneck. If at least one of your kids was born on a pool table, you might be a redneck. If more than one living relative is named after a Southern Civil War general, you might be a redneck. If you just bought an 8-track player to put in your car, you might be a redneck. If you pick your teeth from a catalog, you might be a redneck. If you consider potted meat food product on a saltine and hors d'oeuvre, you might be a redneck. If your mama has ever been involved in a cuss fight with the principal, you might be a redneck. If you own more than 3 shirts with cut-off sleeves, you might be a redneck. If your sophisticated showbiz cousin is a rodeo clown, you might be a redneck. If the strongest smell in your house is butane, you might be a redneck. If you fish in your above-ground pool and catch something, you might be a redneck. If the gas pedal on your car is shaped like a bare foot, you might be a redneck. If your lifetime goal is to own a fireworks stand, you might be a redneck. If your front porch collapses and kills more than 3 dogs, you might be a redneck. If you've got more than one brother named Daryl, you might be a redneck. If you think a chainsaw is a musical instrument, you might be a redneck. If your beer can collection is considered a tourist attraction in your hometown, you might be a redneck. If your home has more miles on it than your pickup, you might be a redneck. If you have to go outside to get something out of the fridge, you might be a redneck. If in an effort to watch your cholesterol, you eat Spam Light, you might be a redneck. If you've asked the preacher, how's it hanging? You might be a redneck. If your mother keeps a spit cup on the ironing board, you might be a redneck. If you think taking a bubble bath starts with eating beans for dinner, you might be a redneck. If you give your dad a gallon of Pepto-Bismol for his birthday, you might be a redneck. If you have a very special baseball cap, just for formal occasions, you might be a redneck. If you can amuse yourself for more than an hour with a fly swatter, you might be a redneck. If you think fast food is hitting a deer at 65 miles per hour, you might be a redneck. If your Christmas tree is still up in February, you might be a redneck. If your kids are going hungry tonight because you just had to have those Yosemite Sam mud flaps, you might be a redneck. If your belt buckle weighs more than 3 pounds, you might be a redneck. If you have an assigned day to wear the family tooth, you might be a redneck. If every electrical outlet in your house is a fire hazard, you might be a redneck. If your wife's best shoes have steel toes, you might be a redneck. If somebody tells you that you've got something in your teeth, so you take them out to see what it is, you might be a redneck. If in tough situations you ask yourself, what would Curly do? You might be a redneck. If your car has never had a full tank of gas, you might be a redneck. If you only need one more hole punched to get your freebie at the House of Tattoos, you might be a redneck. If after making love, you ask your date to roll down the window, you might be a redneck. If your house doesn't have curtains, but your truck does, you might be a redneck. If you watch cartoons long after your kids get bored, you might be a redneck. If your favorite Christmas present was a painting on black velvet, you might be a redneck. If you move your refrigerator and the grass underneath it has turned yellow, you might be a redneck. If your mother has ever come out of the bathroom and proudly announced, "Y'all just got to see this N," you might be a redneck. If you think loading the dishwasher means getting your wife drunk, you might be a redneck. If your only condiment on the dining room table is the economy-size bottle of ketchup, you might be a redneck. If the diploma hanging in your den contains the words Trucking Institute, you might be a redneck. If your father encourages you to quit school cause there's an opening on the lube rack, you might be a redneck. If you own at least 20 baseball hats, you might be a redneck. If there is a stuffed possum anywhere in your house, you might be a redneck. If your anniversary present was getting the septic tank pumped, you might be a redneck. If your family tree doesn't fork, you might be a redneck. If you hammer bottle caps into the frame of your front door to make it look nice, you might be a redneck. If you have more than 3 non-running cars parked in your yard, you might be a redneck. If on stag night, you take a real deer, you might be a redneck. If you list your parole officer as a reference, you might be a redneck. If you have refused to watch the Academy Awards since Smokey and the Bandit was snubbed for Best Picture, you might be a redneck. If more than half the vehicles you own are pickups, you might be a redneck. If you missed your 5th grade graduation because you were on jury duty, you might be a redneck. If you have ever given a rat trap as a gift, you might be a redneck. If the primary color of your car is Bondo, you might be a redneck. If you think loading the dishwasher means getting your wife drunk, you might be a redneck. If mama taught you how to flip a cigarette, you might be a redneck. If an expired license plate means another decoration for your living room wall, you might be a redneck. If you have ever worn shorts to a funeral home, you might be a redneck. If when you leave your house, you are followed by federal agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, and the only thing you worry about is if you can lose them or not, you might be a redneck. If you think beef jerky and moon pies make up 2 of the major food groups, you might be a redneck. If you started a petition to change the national anthem to Georgia on My Mind, you might be a redneck. If there are more than 10 lawsuits currently pending against your dog, you might be a redneck. If a tornado hits your neighborhood and does a $100,000 worth of improvement, you might be a redneck. If you lit a match in the bathroom and your house exploded off its wheels, you might be a redneck. If you watch Little House on the Prairie for decorating tips, you might be a redneck. If you have the local taxidermist on speed dial, you might be a redneck. If your baby's first words were "Attention Kmart shoppers," you might be a redneck. If you prominently display a gift you bought at Grassland, you might be a redneck. If you get an estimate from the barber before he cuts your hair, you might be a redneck. If you ever check the bottom of your shoe for change to get grandma a plug of tobacco, you might be a redneck. If it's easier to spray weed killer on your lawn than mow it, you might be a redneck. If your back porch is bigger than your house, you might be a redneck. If your pocket knife doubles as a toothpick, you might be a redneck. If the receptionist checks the rat traps at your place of business, you might be a redneck. If Motel 6 turns off the lights when they see you coming, you might be a redneck. If the tobacco chewers in your family aren't just men, you might be a redneck. If there are 4 or more cars up on blocks in the front yard, you might be a redneck. If you think a woman who is out of your league bowls on a different night, you might be a redneck. If you have ever taken beer to a job interview, you might be a redneck. If your vehicle has a 2-tone paint job, primer red and primer gray, you might be a redneck. If you own a homemade fur coat, you might be a redneck. If you owe the taxidermist more than half your annual income, you might be a redneck. If the home shopping channel operator recognizes your voice, you might be a redneck. If you have ever shot anyone for looking at you, you might be a redneck. If you have ever bathed with flea and tick soap, you might be a redneck. If bikers back down from your mama, you might be a redneck. If you refer to 5th grade as my senior year, you might be a redneck. If you think a cursor is someone who swears a lot, you might be a redneck. If the blue book value of your truck goes up and down depending on how much gas is in it, you might be a redneck. If you have an Elvis Jello mold, you might be a redneck. If you go to a Tupperware party for a haircut, you might be a redneck. If your high school prom offered daycare, you might be a redneck. If you think the styrofoam cooler is the greatest invention of all time, you might be a redneck. If you have every episode of Hee-Haw on tape, you might be a redneck. If you have ever lost a loved one to kudzu, you might be a redneck. If your mother has ever been involved in a fist fight at a high school sporting event, you might be a redneck. If you have ever stolen toilet paper from a public restroom, you might be a redneck. If you go Christmas shopping for your mum, sister and girlfriend and you only need to buy one gift, you might be a redneck. If you come back from the dump with more than you took, you might be a redneck. If you clean your fingernails with a stick, you might be a redneck. If you own all the components of soap on a rope except the soap, you might be a redneck. If you view family reunions as a great chance to meet babes, you might be a redneck. If your mama would rather go the racetrack than the Kennedy Center, you might be a redneck. If you've used a toilet brush as a back scratcher, you might be a redneck. If your grandmother has ever been asked to leave a bingo game because of her language, you might be a redneck. If you won't stop at a rest area if you have an empty beer can in the car, you might be a redneck. If you have ever hollered, "Rock the house, Bubba," during a piano recital, you might be a redneck. If you have ever worn a tube top to a wedding, you might be a redneck. If the antenna on your truck is a danger to low-flying airplanes, you might be a redneck. If you celebrate Groundhog Day because you believe in it, you might be a redneck. If you think mud wrestling should be an Olympic sport, you might be a redneck. If you have ever attended a funeral or wedding where the pickup trucks outnumb